Hello fellow internet users and welcome to this new edition of Aero Masterclass. There is a part of aviation that is little or poorly known, and I'm talking about business aviation. Today in this video we will discover together what business aviation is, how it is characterized with some data points, and we will focus more particularly on the planes, those who buy them, and why they buy them. This video is the first in a series of Aero Masterclasses dedicated to business aviation. The objectives of this first video are to explain the characteristics of the business aviation market, to show you how it differs from commercial aviation, and to show you the aircraft that make it up and the challenges they face. Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Claude Draillard. I was CFO of Dassault Falconjet, the US subsidiary of Dassault Aviation, and Hondajet. I worked in all aspects of business aviation, launch of new aircraft, including the Falcon 7X, program management, manufacturing, sales, and aftermarket. I am the founder of the consulting firm AvionGarde. Of course, when we think business aviation, we often think private jets, and therefore the jet set. Here, for example, Céline Dion and her Bombardier Challenger. Or here, soccer star Cristiano Ronaldo and his wife in their Embraer Legacy. You might be thinking of medical or evacuation aircraft, such as this Cessna here, which has a stretcher loading support system and probably a life support system on board as well. For those of us who remember the civil war in Lebanon in the 1980s, there was only one road that was usable out of Beirut. The only way to bring in supplies, equipment, and medical personnel was to land on this road with a plane small enough to land there, but big enough to carry everything. The Falcon 50 was the only aircraft that could use this road as a landing strip. I have seen a picture of that aircraft on that road. I've been looking for it, but in vain. If anyone has it, I will add it to this presentation. I personally participated in the mission to send food, supplies, and medical personnel from New York to Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake, when Dassault provided a Falcon 900. You have here a flight attendant who reassures a patient on the left of the screen, with the life support systems at the bottom of the image. On the right, a child who is undergoing chemotherapy and who is transported by CAN. CAN, or Corporate Angel Network, is an association in the US that transports children undergoing cancer treatment and their families, free of charge, from their home to their place of treatment on the business jet of its members. The objective is to allow these families to continue to have as normal a life as possible and to reduce their accommodation costs during treatment. You probably think of government VIP airplanes, and you're right. Transporting government personnel is one of the main origins of business aviation. Indeed, the mission is to bring decision makers on demand, anywhere, in optimal security conditions. Here is the Falcon 900 LX manufactured by Dassault for the UK government, and by the way, sold by a friend of mine, the UK sales director. France is not left out. Here is one of the two Falcon 7Xs of the French Republic. It was nicknamed Color 1 by the aircraft production teams in reference, on the one hand, to the acquisition by the French Air Force of an A330, nicknamed Sarko 1 by the press under the presidency of Nicolas Sarkozy, and on the other hand, to Nicolas Sarkozy's wife, Carla Bruni. And finally, perhaps the most famous business jet in the world, the famous Air Force One, which is a modified Boeing 747-200, VC-25A in the US Air Force classification, operated, of course, by the United Air Force. In that regard, the US federal government can be considered as the largest business jet operator in the world in terms of number of flight hours per year, and with a diversified fleet, the two 747s, but also Gulfstreams, here a Gulfstream 4, Beechcraft King Airs with twin-engine turboprops, and even a Swiss-made Pilatus PC-12. You guessed it from the term business aircraft. It is above all a flying office. As we have seen about government aircraft, business aviation can be defined as the transport of decision makers or key personnel on demand, that is to say at any time, to go anywhere. For example, Sony dedicates its planes to its best engineers to take them to sites where problems arise. It is above all a flying office with access to the internet and private clouds. For these users, it is a work tool whose dispatch decision is subject to a decision tree. It is often a question of security, physical and health, as we learned during COVID, and confidentiality. For example, a team of auditors or mergers and acquisition specialists in a traditional airport can be noticed and recognized, school friends, journalists, whatever. While the same team on a business aircraft traveling from one small local airport to another is more difficult to spot and therefore ensures greater confidentiality to the transaction. This also explains the development of paid spotters who, in fact, participate in economic intelligence, in other words, industrial espionage. I have met some of those spotters, and I can tell you that they make more than a decent living. A business jet, finally, is a space where you can hold meetings without the risk of eavesdropping or work on your laptop without the risk of someone looking over your shoulder. If you've ever tried to work in an Air France economy seat, you know that opening a laptop is already a challenge, and that the people next to you or behind you will always be tempted to look over your shoulder. To provide a frame of reference on business aviation, here are some data points, particularly in comparison with commercial aviation. The fleet sizes are comparable, about 25,000 commercial aircraft in service, like this Boeing 737 from Ryanair on the left, and about 22,000 business aircraft like these two Gulfstreams on the right. Though they're comparable in size, these two fleets are significantly different in number of flight hours. A commercial aircraft flies a few thousand hours a year versus 400 to 500 hours for a business jet on average. On this map, you see the distribution of airports across Europe. The blue dots are the commercial airports that you and I use, and in red are all the airports that can accommodate a business jet. You can see the difference in density and what that implies. For example, if you want to do a Limoges, France to Burgos, Spain, it will take you the day with at least one, if not two, connecting flights in commercial aviation, while you can do it in about 2 hours with a business aircraft. This is even more sensitive in the USA, where distances are much greater. For the record, the state of Texas is 1.5 times the size of France. While commercial aviation has access to about 500 airports in the US and about the same in Europe, business aircraft can use 5,000 airports in the US and about 1,400 in Europe. So the ratios are respectively 10 to 1 and just under 3 to 1. You may be wondering, who are the manufacturers of business aircraft? Again, this is a big difference for commercial aviation, with a more fragmented and sometimes more competitive market. In commercial aviation, we have about 10 manufacturers, including 2 large ones, and a few smaller ones that mainly cover regional transport, although COMAC in China certainly has great ambitions. In business aviation, we have a greater diversity of manufacturers with 3 or 4 players in each segment of business aircraft, and we will get back to that. But in total, we have roughly 20 manufacturers. I'm sure some of you will notice that I didn't put Bombardier on the commercial aviation section, even though there is the CRJ family, technically very close to Bombardier's Challengers. This is simply because Bombardier sold that business to Mitsubishi, and they are, for now, mostly doing aftermarket and no manufacturing, at least for now. A business jet, like any means of transportation, involves a value chain and many players in the manufacturing, sale, and operation until the end of the aircraft's life. We are therefore talking about aircraft manufacturers, or OEMs, for original equipment manufacturers, such as Daher, Dassault, or Airbus, but also their suppliers of all sizes, from the family SME specializing in the heat treatment of metallic parts to Thales and Safran. In the aircraft sales transaction, we also find a galaxy of actors such as brokers, lawyers, financing providers, tax specialists, insurers, etc. Once the aircraft is in operation, we find the same players as in commercial aviation, with the difference that they are rarely internalized, like Air France Industries for Air France, but rather outsourced, Avex Aviation, Duncan, or in some cases integrated to the OEMs, just like Jet Aviation, sister company of Gulfstream, or ExecuJet, which belongs to Dassault Aviation now. There are of course exceptions. I know a medical test company in the US that has its own fleet of aircraft. They do their own maintenance, including heavy checks, and engine work. I also know an individual in Connecticut who has multiple aircraft with his own mechanics team. They even performed a C-check on a Falcon 50 a few years ago, and it took them about 18 months, when a Dassault authorized service center would have done it in 4 to 5 months. For the most sophisticated players, there are aircraft management companies often working alongside so-called charter operators, Part 135 in the USA, or AOC in the EASA world. Finally, a word about FBOs like JetX, for example. FBO means fixed base operation, basically an airport terminal dedicated to business aviation. There you'll find lounges, sometimes showers, and the possibility of accessing other services, ground transportation, etc. Do you have any idea of the overall economic impact of business aviation? I will try to give you some reference points, and it is up to you to do further research or ask me some questions in the comments of the video. In terms of employment, between direct and indirect impacts, in the US, we're talking about 1.1 million jobs related to business aviation. In Europe, it's evaluated to be about 500,000 jobs. There is another 500,000 in the rest of the world. So in total, 2 to 2.5 million jobs in the world are related to business aviation. Beyond employment, overall, business aviation represents $219 billion of the US GDP and about 1 billion euros in Europe. As a rule of thumb, a business jet generates about $2.5 million of economic activity where the aircraft is based. There are airports that specialize in business aviation. In this picture, on the left of your screen, you see Teterboro Airport, the #1 business aviation in the world in terms of traffic. You can see a triangle on the top right of this left picture. The large white building just out of the triangle is the Dassault offices where I used to work. In the right image, you see the position of Teterboro relative to New York City, the red dot on the top left. Teterboro is actually in the state of New Jersey, and at the bottom right you see New York JFK Airport and how Teterboro and JFK are on opposite sides of New York City. For those of you who have seen the movie Sully, Teterboro is the airport where Sully was trying to divert to. In Europe, the #1 airport is Le Bourget, the mythical airport where Lindbergh landed after his first transatlantic flight. The airport has 2 main runways, and on the right you see where Le Bourget is located compared to Paris. It is basically halfway between Paris and CDG Airport. The second European airport, and there is a strong competition between Nice and Geneva, is half the size of Le Bourget in terms of traffic. You're going to tell me, what about the planes? Here you have a statistic on deliveries over the last 20 years. Official figures for 2024 are not yet available. This measurement is incomplete. I did it specifically to count the planes that are competitors of Dassault planes each year. So it only includes jets and even only jets of a certain size. On the other hand, we can clearly see the relationship between aircraft deliveries and the state of the economy. Each crisis has a direct impact on the volumes delivered, and the long-term trend is upwards, but not by much. You clearly see the impact of the internet bubble in the early 2000s, of the subprime crisis between 2008 and 2012, and the COVID crisis, even though this one had other consequences that were unexpected. We can talk about this further in another video. Clearly, you see that the vast majority of business aviation customers are corporations. NGOs, governments, and JetSet are marginal customers in terms of delivery volumes. Companies that purchase aircraft can be of all sizes, ranging from entrepreneurs who have activities far from each other or who require immediate responses, SMEs with activities or key partners far away, to large groups for which business jets are either a preferred mode of transportation for executives or, and this is not exclusive, a mode of transportation for the key personnel in the execution of the company's operations. One example is Sony, who uses their fleet for their top engineer who are dispatched to production sites that manufacture Sony-branded products. Nothing is more expensive to Sony than a production site that is stopped, and therefore they need to send their best people ASAP. Where are the customers located? A geographical distribution of customers is surprisingly not an exact science. because the criteria taken into account vary according to the sources. Is it the operational base of the aircraft, the nationality of the owner, but then what about financing companies often located in tax havens that would distort the data, or the registration of the aircraft? Well, that said, the distortion induced by these different measures is relatively low. The distribution here is quite close to the operational distribution of the aircraft. You see that 2/3 of the worldwide fleet is based in North America, US, Mexico, Canada, and about 20% in Europe, just about 10% in South America, mostly Brazil for obvious distance reasons, and the rest is spread between Asia, Africa, and Oceania. About 15 years ago, looking at this distribution, if you'd asked me how it would evolve, I would have said that Asia's share would increase significantly. Why? Because the entire industry thought China would absorb large volumes. But it didn't happen for a multitude of reasons, but primarily because the airspace over 10,000 feet is controlled by the military. While they have little issues with airline schedules, they struggle when an aircraft files a non-regular flight plan and is supposed to be airborne in the next 30 minutes. Some logos of user companies that you may recognize or not. NetJets, the world's #1 in fractional ownership of business aircraft. Buy aircraft is a clear part of their core business. GE, Nike, Michelin, you know them all. Orbis uses DC-10 transformed into an ophthalmology hospital that travels the world, especially in war zones or where a natural disaster took place. Chopin Vodka, the world's #1 potato vodka producer, based in the outskirts of Warsaw. They use a business jet to go and see their key ingredient suppliers and their distribution centers. Innisfree, a turnkey hotel solution in the USA, whose founding couple never had an aircraft before. After over a year of usage, they said that the purchase of the plane allows them to do 1 or 2 more projects per year than before they had the aircraft. So why do they buy aircraft? Flexibility. You're not bound by airline schedules. You leave when you're ready, no connection time constraints. All your flights are nonstop and direct. You leave when you're ready. Just call the pilot and you're flying less than 30 minutes later. Time saving. You don't drive for hours to reach a commercial airport. You don't wait for your luggage. They're behind you. On average, in the US, a business trip as the crow flies is less than 400 miles, or about 650 kilometers. And yet, with the hub-and-spoke model of the airlines, we travel about 1,200 miles per trip. A personal example is a flight from Teterboro, New York, to Little Rock, Arkansas, where the Falcon Customization Center is. It's a 1,600-mile trip, or 2,000 kilometers, from New York, the equivalent of a Paris to Moscow or a Paris to Algiers. Door to door, with the airlines, this means leaving home at 4 in the morning to arrive on site around noon, 1 p.m. New York time, with a connection of at least 1 hour, meaning I've been up for 9 hours by the time I start working. With the Falcon, I crossed the street from my office when the aircraft was ready, prepared my meetings in flight, and started them in Little Rock less than 3 hours later. Safety. You control your environment. You know the people on the plane. If it's your company plane, you know the crew, and sometimes even the ground crew. Confidentiality. You have a strategic meeting without fear of being listened to. No unauthorized person is trying to read your computer screen over your shoulder. No risk of being spotted by a competitor, supplier, customer during onboarding. Productivity gain. The connected aircraft has been a reality for about 15 years. Since the 2010s, onboard internet has been a must. Customers have declared AOGs, or aircraft on the ground, meaning the aircraft cannot carry out its mission, because the Wi-Fi didn't work. Your aircraft is a flying office before being a flying living room. You arrive at your destination, relaxed, ready, rested, and active. You return home faster, earlier, thus ensuring a better life balance. One example is one of the first demo flights I was involved with for a Falcon 2000 prospect. We positioned the aircraft in Oslo, Norway the night before, picked up the customer at 7 in the morning, and took him to see a customer and one of his facilities in Spain. He was back home to put his kids to bed. That's the kind of work-life balance you can achieve with a business aircraft. If companies buy these planes, it is because there is an economic interest for them. We were talking about saving time, flexibility, etc. All that for these companies is money. How do you quantify it? Well, this is what OEM sales teams and business aircraft brokers do very often. That said, major business aviation trade organizations conduct studies regularly to support OEM sales efforts. Let's see what these studies say. Of the companies that own the 100 best brands in the world, 98% own or use a business aircraft. Among the companies that make up the S&P 500 index on the NYSE, those that use business aviation are doing better than their competitors by 70%. Private and public companies that use business aviation see, on average, their revenue growth outperforming their competitors by 23%. Hence the NBA's campaign that was called "No Plane, No Gain." We were talking earlier about the size of companies that buy business aircraft. Here is the statistics. 57% of companies that use business aviation have less than 500 employees. I was mentioning that a business aircraft is not only the transportation of the top executives of the company. The study shows that top executives are on board less than 50% of the time. Now you could say that the data is biased because it includes ferry flights to and from a service center. Well, even if you take those flights out of the equation, you still come up with executives on board less than 50% of the time. You're going to ask me again, what about the planes? We're getting there, just a little bit more patience. Because the range of missions is wide, the quantities and types of aircraft are also wide. We will cover the main categories of business aircraft and see the main aircraft that make them up, with an estimate of the price of new in each case. Before that, let me show you this chart. It shows delivery volumes by category of airplanes. Lights, like the Hondajet, mediums, like the Cessna Citation XLS, and the heavies, like the current lineup at Dassault. You see clearly that the proportion of the lights increases over time and taking some of the deliveries from the heavies. This is an obvious trend in that direction, driven by SMEs buying aircraft. I'm going to quickly go over this chart and the next two that were published by Jefferies. Those charts are showing for each of the three categories we just talked about how the aircraft are positioned in range and price. They are interesting because they show how dense the market is and therefore how intense the competition can be on each segment. It is even showing better for the mediums. Do you see how clustered those points are? It is still true when you look at the heavies, even though we're talking about machines that easily reach $35 million and up to $75 million or above for bizliners, that's to say, commercial aircraft outfitted with a VIP interior. Okay, I promised, here they are, we're going to look at airplanes. Let's start with single-engine turboprops, like this TBM manufactured by Draillard in Tarbes, France. This specific TBM is owned by famous film director Francis Ford Coppola. He's using the TBM to fly from his residence in Northern California to the studios in Hollywood close to LA. The current production version of the TBM 960, sells for about $5.3 million. Moving up in size, here is a twin-engine turboprop, a Piaggio Avanti, of the Italian Air Force. I could have shown a Beechcraft King Air, which is probably more ubiquitous in the category, but I like the Avanti for its unusual and innovative aerodynamic configuration, but mostly for its cabin that customers love, as it is very quiet while the aircraft from the outside is rather loud. A Piaggio Avanti or a King Air are worth about $9 million when sold new today. You've got here a Hondajet. This photo was taken at the delivery of its Hondajet to Tom Cruise. Alongside the famous actor in the picture is Mr. Fujino, who created the Hondajet and was the first CEO of Honda Aircraft. The paint job of this aircraft is unique. This is the only Hondajet that does not have the red Honda logo neither on the fuselage nor on the engine nacelles. The paint job itself was designed by Mr. Fujino personally for Tom Cruise. Moving up to the light jets, you have here a PC-24 manufactured by Pilatus in Switzerland. This one flies with the Royal Flying Doctors, which is an Australian NGO. With that category of aircraft, you go further, you have more room in the cabin and ability to customize it. These aircraft sell for about $12 million, and at that price point, you have probably a decent balance between personal use and business use of the aircraft. We're getting now to the mid-size segment, where this Learjet 75 produced by Learjet. The Learjet 75 is unfortunately no longer in production, but it remains a good representative of the segment, with a fuselage that is still relatively narrow, while the aircraft is able of longer flights. Moving up to the large cabin, here is the Falcon 2000 LXS, which is to my mind the best representative of this category of business jets. I really appreciate this aircraft for its versatility. She can use short runways, do hot takeoffs, and yet cross the Atlantic easily. However, this is a $35 million aircraft, sometimes a little more depending on how loaded she is. Among the long-range aircraft, this is a Falcon 900 LX. I have actually seen that airplane, fresh out of the paint booth, at the Little Rock Completion Center. If you ever buy an aircraft, please do not spec a matte black finish like this one. It is very hard to maintain and touch up, and if on top of that you live in a part of the world where it's very hot, a black paint job is not recommended. Finally, we're getting to the ultra-long-range aircraft. In this category, one of the main aircraft is the Bombardier Global 7500, like this one here. It's an aircraft that is in production and is the top of the range at Bombardier. They have announced a Global 8000, but it is not here yet. This aircraft here can fly over 7,500 nautical miles. This aircraft is huge. Its footprint on the ground is about the same as an Airbus A320. Okay, you might ask, but what's it like on board? To answer this question, let's take a look at some examples of interiors, from the simplest to the most exotic. Generally speaking, the bigger the plane, the more you can customize the interior and do unique things. I will show you some interiors and which plane each interior corresponds to, so that you have an idea of the proportions. Let's begin with this TBM 960, similar to the one I showed you earlier with Francis Ford Coppola. This is a nice interior, but tight. Though the seats are comfortable, with leather, nice seat foam, you can see how they're squeezed together. There are SUVs that are roomier. To maybe explain this better, here is the aircraft that has those exact seats. You get on board via this large door, and you see it's not very large. Now when you get to the next size up, for instance here a Hondajet, you can see there is more room. There is space between the seats, there are folding tables, more light inside the cabin. Behind the two seats you're seeing, there are pocket doors in the bulkhead that close off a full lavatory, which has been a selling point for female customers. The lavatory is standard on the Hondajet, while it is optional on the TBM you saw previously. Again, to put things in perspective, this is the size of the Hondajet. The cross-section is not significantly different from the TBM, and yet the space on board is quite different. Let's jump a few categories of aircraft and go straight for the Falcon 6X. You can see there is way more room just by comparing the space between those two seats on the left front section of the cabin with what we saw earlier on the Hondajet. The wood veneer are conveying a warm atmosphere, the windows are bigger, but that's thanks to the aircraft being larger as well. The level of customization is also much higher, and you can get almost anything you want as long as it is certifiable. Now you see the Falcon 6X on the ground. It is not the prettiest picture of a 6X that you can find, but I like it because first I took it when the aircraft came to Dallas Love Field to be presented by the Falconjet sales team, but mostly because you see people on the right of the nose of the aircraft, and that gives a better idea of the size of the aircraft. But there is even bigger. Here is the mock-up of the Falcon 10X that Dassault has shown around the world. Here the sky is the limit. This is the fourth living area of the aircraft in the aft section, where you have a permanent bedroom as opposed to lie-flight seats or a foldable sofa. You can see a real bathroom in the back with a shower, a lavatory, etc. You can push the customization even further than what you can do on the Falcon 6X. For instance, there was a company that had a logo with red, blue, and white in it about 25 years ago. They asked us to alternate red, white, and blue seats throughout the cabin, and that's what we did. To give you an idea of the size of the Falcon 10X, just look at the number of windows. You can see it is a really large aircraft that is comparable to the Global 7500 we saw earlier, and therefore the footprint is pretty much what a Boeing 737 or an Airbus A320 is. For a business jet, that's starting to be a very large aircraft. But wait, there is more! Here is the bathroom of a Boeing 777. Yes, you can take a commercial aircraft and replace the airline layout with a VIP configuration. Here, this is an aircraft I have seen that was designed originally by GDC Techniques for a Singaporean customer. I know Paris apartments where the bathroom is nowhere near that size. You may wonder if among the customizations I saw, a few stood out to me. There are two that jump to mind. An A330 VIP from ACJ for Airbus Corporate Jet, with a gym equipped with a rowing machine, a bike, etc., and the equipment necessary to hold everything in place in case of turbulences. There is also a Falcon 7X that was ordered by the then CEO of Formula One, the company that owns the Formula One brand and organizes the Grand Prix. He realized he spent as much time on the plane as he did at home, so he needed closets to have the same number of shirts, suits, shoes, etc. So we started by designing the closets, and as we progressively added closets, we took seats out. In the end, we went from a typical Falcon 7X configuration with 14 passengers to just 8 passengers. How do you become a business aircraft pilot? It depends, and it even depends on several things. What country are you in? Rules vary between different civil aviation authorities, so check the requirements. What category is the aircraft? If it is a turboprop, in some cases a commercial IFR license is enough. A type rating is recommended, but not mandatory. If it is a jet, even if it is certified for single pilot operations, a type rating is mandatory. Is the operator private or commercial? If it's a commercial flight, generally operators require an ATP. That said, we don't have enough pilots, so some operators are using the right seat, second in command, for non-ATP pilots to allow them to accumulate flight hours and experience. The pilot in command in the left seat is then a captain with an ATP and instructor experience. How far can you fly a business jet? Let's go back in time a little bit. This is the range of a Dassault Falcon 20-5 from the early 1980s with its TFE 731 engines, which are still in production for the Falcon 900LX. You can see that out of Paris, you can fly to any point in Europe, but you can't reach New York. To get to New York, you need to stop over in Iceland or in Greenland. Similarly, you can reach the Near East, but not the Middle East. If you want to go even further, like South Africa, Australia, this requires multiple stops. Today, with the Falcon 8X that Dassault produces since 2016, still out of Paris, you can go pretty much anywhere in the world. Okay, you need a stop to go to Santiago or Canberra, but you can do a 12-hour flight without any problem. Let's talk again about this Dassault Falcon 20-5 in the early 80s. Its cruising speed was around Mach 0.8, and frankly, the following aircraft did only marginally better, between Mach 0.8 and Mach 0.85, with the notable exception of the Cessna Citation 10, which has two big engines that propels it to Mach 0.935. The Citation 10 is no longer in production today, but it is very recognizable with its 37-degree swept wing that is not dissimilar to the 1960s fighter jets. We made a technological leap around 2010, and all manufacturers are now aligning themselves with the speed of Mach 0.9 or a little more. Why? Obviously because the distances require it. When you fly from Paris to Tokyo at Mach 0.8 or at Mach 0.9, you don't spend the same time in the air. So here are a few examples on the left of your screen. Gulfstream announces Mach 0.9 over 7,000 nautical miles. Dassault promises a trip from New York to Dubai at Mach 0.9, while Bombardier's Global 7500 flies at Mach 0.925. So speeds are getting normalized for ultra-long-range aircraft around Mach 0.9. So what's next? Well, we all dream of a supersonic business jet. There have been plenty of studies about them. Dassault showed a supersonic jet based on the fuselage of the Falcon 50 in the mid-90s, Gulfstream has worked for years with NASA and DARPA, and Bombardier with other research centers. The question is there a market for those aircraft? Now, a lot of people think there is, but it is far from certain. The rendering you see here on the screen comes from Spike Aerospace in the US. Spike has this project called the Diplomat that targets to fly from New York to London in less than 3 hours, but it takes about 6.5 hours today. In today's world, we cannot talk about business aircraft without mentioning the environmental footprint of business aviation. Even if you think my opinion is somewhat biased, let's try to approach the subject without passion. What do we see on this chart published by the UN? Transportation as a whole is about 15% of total worldwide emissions. Agriculture is 18% and energy production is about 26%. Among the 15% of transportation, ground transportation has the lion's share with 10%. So that leaves 5% for maritime and air transportation. In this 5%, aviation in total has long stagnated around 2% and has increased to 2.5% with the increase in commercial and cargo aircraft fleets, Amazon for instance. Business aviation represents 2% of the 2.5%, or 0.05% of the total. It is therefore part of the problem for sure, but perhaps not one of the top priorities. Business aviation is one of the industries that has engaged in a dialogue with all stakeholders and including various environmental protection associations on the subject. And we, as an industry, have made a lot of progress. The average aircraft emits 11% less today than the average aircraft of 2005. There are big peaks and valleys between the years related to the age of the active fleet. But with the renewal of the fleet and the progressive weight of newer aircraft that burn less fuel, you get to those minus 11%. I'd like to remind you of an incident at London Stansted Airport last June that you probably saw on your favorite news channel. A team from Stop Oil organized what looked like a commando operation by cutting through the airport fence to access the business aviation area of the airport. They then covered a plane in orange paint and were arrested by the authorities as they were about to do the same to a second plane. They were looking for Taylor Swift's plane. Well, they got the plane wrong. This is a Gulfstream 5 and Swift is flying a 2009 Dassault Falcon 7X. These people are now in prison for violating the airport perimeter. But above all, these people missed their own point. The plane covered in paint had to be cleaned with huge quantities of solvent that alone represent more than a year's worth of emissions of the same aircraft. Furthermore, this plane was supposed to transport organs for transplants that same day. One person did not receive the kidney in time and died. These actions are certainly spectacular, but the general opinion, and that includes environmental NGOs, this is not the solution. Dialogue is the solution. As such, several organizations have been invited to speak at business aviation conferences. Each time, in less than 5 minutes, the conversation moves from emissions to income and wealth inequalities. The issue is environmental, but mostly social and related to the impacts of modern economies on social inequalities, which is not my topic here. Business aviation has made a commitment to net zero by 2050. We're not going to get there without doing anything, especially since the projections from 2009 and 2015 using the same technologies were rather catastrophic. In 2009, the forecast showed more than double the emissions, and in 2015, the projection shows just under that level. How are we going to get there? We're already doing mission calculations, taking into account weather conditions and the city pair to calculate routes, including altitudes, that emit less. We already do SAF. SAF stands for Sustainable Aviation Fuel. It is basically a jet fuel that is the byproduct of domestic wastes, notably cooking oil. The wastes are compacted, processed, and refined to produce fuel compatible with aircraft and engine systems. The issue right now is that there is not enough SAF produced to meet the demand from airlines, cargo, and business aviation. Newer aircraft are capable of at least 50% SAF and up to 100% as Dassault promises for the Falcon 10X. Older aircraft are usually capable of 20 to 30% SAF, with some going up to 50%. A good rule of thumb is 30%. New technologies in materials, engines, such as the hydrogen hybrid engine that Pratt & Whitney is working on, and onboard electrical generation are emerging. Onboard electrical generation is interesting because the best we can use it, the better we generate electricity on board, the more efficient the aircraft will be and the less we would consume. Since we're talking about electric, here is Alice, the 100% electric plane from Aviation. Aviation is a company based in the Seattle area that has been developing an electric plane since 2015. The goal is to cover regional transport, like Boston to New York. For commercial aviation, cargo, DHL is involved in the project, but also a VIP version that is under discussion with this new aerodynamic configuration. Alice has already received about 600 orders, notably from DHL, Cape Air in the US, and Air New Zealand. The development program is done in partnership with NASA and the FAA. Alice is expected to be certified in late 2026, with deliveries in 2027 based on Magnix Electric's motors, which themselves have their own certification plan and timeline. And for the fans and those who want to try it, Alice is available on Microsoft Flight Simulator. In Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, Han Solo concludes, "Let the Wookiee win." Now it's our turn to conclude. What should you remember from this video? You have now seen that business aviation is not only made for the jet set, but essentially about responding to economic challenges. You have seen characteristic examples of aircraft and their interiors. And finally, we've discussed the challenges of the future of business aviation, such as speed and environmental impact. See you soon in the comments and in future videos. Until then, enjoy your flights.